April 26, 1986. A disaster that changed lives overnight. A city, a nation, an entire continent. Everything was altered forever. But what really happened? The official reports speak of an accident. But what was hidden behind the scenes? Panic in the control room, systems failing one by one, and then that terrifying explosion. Was it truly just a mistake? Or was it the beginning of something far more sinister? No one knew what was happening, but death had already filled the air. This is not just the story of a disaster. It is the dark truth behind one of humanity's greatest mistakes. Are you ready to learn the truth? Keep watching now. April 25th, 1986. Tension was mounting in the control room of the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The night shift had begun, and workers with sleepy eyes stared at the monitors. The long-delayed safety test for Reactor 4 was finally about to begin. It had been postponed several times before, but tonight it had to be completed. The chief engineer gave his final instructions to the operators. A controlled power reduction was to be carried out, but no one knew exactly how the reactor would respond. As the hours passed, an eerie silence settled over the control room. The reactor's power was dropping rapidly on the system screens. Normally, it should have been around 700 megawatts, but it fell to 500, 300, 200, and suddenly down to 30 megawatts. The operators were panicked. Running the reactor at such low power was dangerous, but they were under orders to continue the test. The chief engineer was determined. Increase the power again. The control rods were slowly withdrawn. The power level started to rise again. But this was a critical mistake. Unbeknownst to them, the reactor had already entered a dangerously unstable state. The cooling system had been reduced too much, and internal pressure was rapidly increasing. One by one, the alarm systems in the control room began to activate. Steam pressure was reaching dangerous levels, and water levels were critically low. An operator anxiously reported, "The steam chamber is overloaded." The chief engineer, with a stern voice, replied, "Continue, this is normal." But it was anything but normal. Inside the reactor core, a lethal chain reaction had already begun. The graphite moderator was overheating, and temperatures were soaring into the thousands of degrees. And then a loud explosion rang out. But this was just a warning. Workers jumped in fear, and panic spread through the control room. A few seconds later, a deafening blast shook the entire plant. And then the second explosion. This time, the reactor core was completely destroyed. The 1,200-ton steel reactor lid was hurled into the air and crashed back down, tearing through the structure. Workers in the corridors were thrown against the walls by the shock wave. Looking up, they saw that the reactor building's roof was gone. A strange blue-green glow was rising into the night sky. It was the first sign of deadly radiation. But the disaster was just beginning. Thick black smoke billowed out of the plant, spreading rapidly into the sky. Tiny fragments of radioactive graphite carrying lethal doses of radiation were scattered in all directions. When the fire alarm sounded, Pripyat's fire department was called. But they were only told it was a small roof fire. The firefighters arrived at the plant to find a massive column of smoke. Some workers were lying on the ground, their eyes glazed, their skin reddened. They had no idea how high the radiation levels were. They grabbed their hoses and began battling the flames. But then they noticed something strange. When they sprayed water on the fire, the flames glowed in an eerie way. Some of the firefighters sensed that something was terribly wrong. They began to feel dizzy and nauseous. An invisible death surrounded them, but none of them knew it yet. Within hours, red spots began appearing on the firefighters' faces. Their eyes were bloodshot, their bodies trembling. Yet they kept fighting the fire. Radiation levels around the plant were rising rapidly. As the hours passed, radiation soared to 16 times the lethal limit, endangering every living being in the area. But the city was still asleep. Only a few hours had passed since the explosion. But the people of Pripyat were still going about their daily lives. People were getting ready for work. Children were running around in playgrounds. No one knew that an invisible enemy was silently creeping through the streets. In the early morning hours, some workers began to feel unwell. Headaches, nausea, a metallic taste in their mouths. No one knew what it meant. The people of Pripyat thought there had been a small fire at the reactor, but the reality was far more terrifying. The radioactive particles leaking from the destroyed reactor were silently seeping into homes, contaminating the water, the soil, and the human body. The number of people visiting the hospital started to rise. Doctors had no idea what to do. Patients with rising fevers and red marks on their skin were coming in one after another. But the city authorities remained silent. The Soviet officials tried to downplay the situation. But the radiation levels around the reactor had reached thousands of times the normal limit. Police cars started to quietly patrol the city. Their goal was to maintain control without causing panic. The citizens were filled with questions. What's happening? But the only response from the authorities was, there is nothing to worry about. But the reality was quite the opposite. Exactly 36 hours after the explosion, the evacuation order was finally issued. Officials made an announcement. This is a temporary evacuation. You will return in a few hours. Take only your essential belongings. As people hurried out of their homes, they didn't know they were leaving their entire lives behind. Toys, photographs, memories, all left in the shadow of radiation. Thousands of people boarded buses. Mothers held their children close. The elderly whispered silent prayers. But those who looked back at their homes for the last time had fear and uncertainty in their eyes. As the buses left the city, Pripyat had become a ghost town. Thousands of soldiers, workers, and volunteers were called in to contain the disaster. These heroes, who would go down in history as the liquidators, were sent to clean up the area around the reactor. But their mission was a dance with death. They worked with inadequate protective equipment. They collected graphite debris with their bare hands. Most of them were exposed to lethal radiation within a short period. But for the Soviet government, they were merely individuals doing their duty. Hundreds of thousands lost their lives or battled severe illnesses. Yet Chernobyl remained silent. The radioactive clouds from Chernobyl spread across much of Europe with the wind. Nuclear power plants in Sweden, Poland, and Germany detected abnormal radiation levels. The Soviet Union could no longer hide the truth. Soviet officials were forced to admit that the reactor had been completely destroyed. But it was too late. As radiation spread through the atmosphere, millions of people were put at risk. Farmlands became contaminated. Animals fell ill. And over the years, cancer cases among people increased dramatically. Today, Chernobyl remains one of the most dangerous places in the world. The reactor has been covered with a massive steel sarcophagus. But this is only a temporary solution. Deadly levels of radiation still linger inside. The abandoned city of Pripyat stands as a monument defying time. The buildings are empty. The toys are covered in dust. But the radiation is still here. The effects of the disaster are not just physical. Chernobyl has shown the entire world how critical safety protocols truly are. This is the story of Chernobyl, but it's not just a disaster of the past. It's also a warning for the future. There are lessons to be learned from history, but they only matter to those who remember. If this story has impacted you, and you believe that humanity must never forget its mistakes, don't forget to like this video. Subscribe to our channel for more content, and share your thoughts with us in the comments. Your opinion matters, because the future is shaped by those who learn from the past. Now, like, subscribe, and share this story.